The lights are dimming across European capitals tonight, and it has nothing to do with energy conservation. From the corridors of the Élysée Palace to the boardrooms of nuclear giants like Orano, a singular realization is crystallizing. The era of plundering African resources with impunity is ending. Niger, a landlocked Sahelian nation that most Europeans couldn't locate on a map 6 months ago, has just delivered the most devastating blow to European neocolonialism since Ghana's independence in 1957. Welcome back to the channel, family. Today, we're diving deep into how Niger's uranium revolution is reshaping global power dynamics and why every African patriot should be paying attention to what's unfolding in Niamey. This isn't just about one mineral in one country. This is about the fundamental transformation of Africa's relationship with its former colonizers. And trust me, the implications stretch far beyond anything you've seen covered in mainstream media. Before we unpack this seismic shift, let me paint you a picture of just how profoundly Niger's uranium has shaped the modern world. Nestled beneath the ancient sands of the Sahel lies approximately 40% of the world's uranium reserves. For over 5 decades, French multinational Orano, formerly known as Areva, has extracted this precious resource under agreements so lopsided they would make Cecil Rhodes blush with embarrassment. Consider the mathematical absurdity of Niger's situation under French tutelage. This nation, blessed with enough uranium to power half the planet, remained trapped in crushing poverty, while France generated 70% of its electricity from nuclear power plants fueled by Nigerian uranium. The average French citizen enjoyed abundant electricity, while the average Nigerian lived without reliable power. This wasn't development partnership. This was systematic resource extraction designed to perpetuate dependency and underdevelopment. The architects of this arrangement understood precisely what they were constructing. François-Xavier Verschave, the late French economist who coined the term Françafrique, documented how Paris maintained a chokehold on African economies through currency manipulation, debt structures, and resource extraction agreements. Niger's uranium contracts epitomize this model: maximum extraction, minimum compensation, perpetual dependency. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré emerged as Burkina Faso's leader, many observers initially dismissed his rise as another military intervention in West Africa's complex political landscape. However, those who studied his background, his rhetoric, and his immediate policy implementations recognized something far more significant was unfolding. Here was a leader who understood that genuine sovereignty required economic independence, and economic independence demanded control over natural resources. Traoré's influence on regional consciousness cannot be understated. His articulate critiques of neocolonialism, delivered in fluent French to European audiences, resonated across the Sahel with unprecedented force. Young Africans from Dakar to Khartoum began sharing clips of Traoré challenging French officials, questioning decades of exploitative arrangements, and demanding authentic partnerships based on mutual respect rather than historical subjugation. This intellectual awakening created fertile ground for Niger's uranium revolution. When Niger's military leadership, inspired by Traoré's example and emboldened by shifting regional dynamics, began scrutinizing their uranium arrangements with France, they discovered what many suspected: decades of systematically undervalued contracts that transferred billions in wealth from African soil to European coffers. The numbers are staggering and deserve careful examination. Niger produces approximately 5,000 tons of uranium annually, making it the world's 4th largest producer. Under existing French contracts, Niger received roughly 15% of the market value for its uranium. The remaining 85% flowed directly to Orano and, by extension, the French economy. This arrangement generated approximately 3 billion euros annually for French nuclear operations, while Niger's treasury received a fraction of that amount. Now imagine the psychological impact of this revelation spreading through Niger's population. Imagine discovering that your nation's greatest natural gift, a resource essential to modern technological civilization, has been systematically undervalued for generations while your children lacked access to basic education and healthcare. The anger was righteous, the demand for change inevitable. Niger's new leadership didn't simply cancel contracts in a fit of emotional rebellion. They engaged in sophisticated economic analysis, consulting with Chinese, Russian, and Indian partners who offered dramatically different terms. Where France proposed 15% value capture, alternative partners suggested 60 to 70%. Where France demanded exclusive long-term contracts, other nations offered shorter terms with regular renegotiation opportunities. The contrast was so stark, it bordered on the absurd. Chinese companies offered to build processing facilities within Niger, creating local employment and adding value before export. Russian partnerships included technology transfer agreements and infrastructure development components. Indian proposals incorporated educational exchange programs and technical training initiatives. France's response revealed the desperation of a declining imperial power. Rather than improving their offers to remain competitive, French officials resorted to threats, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. They froze Niger's foreign reserves, imposed travel restrictions on leadership figures, and lobbied international organizations to isolate the new government. These actions only reinforced Niger's conviction that breaking free from French dependency was absolutely necessary. The ripple effects across Europe have been immediate and profound. France's nuclear industry, which employs over 200,000 workers and generates over 50 billion euros annually, suddenly faced an existential crisis. Without guaranteed access to Niger's uranium at below-market prices, French electricity costs began rising immediately. The knock-on effects touched every sector of the French economy, from manufacturing to services. But France's crisis extends beyond immediate economic disruption. The loss of Niger represents a fundamental challenge to France's global status and regional influence. For decades, France leveraged its African relationships to maintain relevance in international forums, secure UN Security Council support, and project power beyond its geographical limitations. Without privileged access to African resources and markets, France's claim to great power status becomes increasingly tenuous. The broader European Union faces equally serious implications. European industries dependent on stable, affordable energy supplies suddenly confront dramatic cost increases and supply uncertainties. Germany, already grappling with energy security following its break with Russian gas, now faces additional nuclear fuel challenges. The entire European project of energy independence becomes more complex and expensive without guaranteed African resource flows. Understanding the youth dimension of this transformation requires appreciating how profoundly Traoré's message resonated with Africa's demographic majority. Across the continent, approximately 60% of the population is under 25 years old. This generation, educated through internet access and global communication networks, possesses unprecedented awareness of global inequality and historical exploitation patterns. Young Nigerians didn't need academic studies to understand their uranium's value. They could observe French prosperity alongside their own poverty. They could see gleaming French cities powered by Nigerian uranium, while their own communities lacked basic electricity. This generation rejected the narrative that such arrangements represented natural or inevitable outcomes. Social media amplified these realizations exponentially. Videos of Traoré's speeches, translated into local languages and shared across platforms, reached millions of young Africans. Hashtags like Africa Rising and Hark Resource Sovereignty began trending across the continent. Young people organized solidarity demonstrations in support of Niger's leadership, creating unprecedented Pan-African consciousness around resource sovereignty issues. The mainstream media response to Niger's uranium revolution has been predictably biased and requires serious deconstruction. European outlets consistently frame Niger's decisions as destabilizing, dangerous, or economically irrational. They warn of Chinese influence without acknowledging decades of French exploitation. They express concern for democratic governance while ignoring France's support for corrupt puppet leaders throughout the region. This media narrative serves specific interests, maintaining European access to African resources while discrediting African agency and decision-making capacity. By portraying Niger's choices as reckless or externally manipulated, European media attempts to delegitimize authentic African sovereignty movements and justify continued interference. Critical media literacy becomes essential for understanding these dynamics. When European outlets warn about Chinese involvement in African resource sectors, ask yourself, did they express similar concern about French involvement over the past 60 years? When they question the legitimacy of African leadership changes, consider their silence regarding decades of French-backed dictators who served European rather than African interests. The economic analysis reveals why Europe's panic is entirely rational. Niger's uranium decision creates a precedent that threatens the entire foundation of European prosperity. If Niger can successfully renegotiate resource contracts to capture fair value, what prevents other African nations from following suit? The potential cascade effect could fundamentally restructure global economic relationships. Consider the mathematical implications. If just 5 major African resource producers, Niger, Democratic Republic of Congo, Botswana, Guinea, and Gabon, renegotiated their contracts to capture 60% rather than 15% of their resources' market value. The wealth transfer from Europe to Africa would exceed $100 billion annually. Such a shift would accelerate African development, while forcing European economies to confront their actual competitive capabilities without subsidized resource access. The regional context amplifies these concerns for European policymakers. Mali and Burkina Faso have already expelled French forces and begun reviewing their resource arrangements. Chad, Senegal, and Ivory Coast face growing domestic pressure to reassess their relationships with former colonizers. The momentum toward authentic sovereignty appears unstoppable across the Sahel. Pan-African cooperation emerges as perhaps the most significant long-term development stemming from Niger's uranium revolution. For the first time since the liberation era, African leaders are coordinating resource policies and sharing negotiation strategies. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement provides institutional framework for such cooperation, while leaders like Traoré provide intellectual leadership and moral courage. This coordination terrifies European policymakers because it eliminates their traditional strategy of playing African nations against each other. When Chad considers renegotiating its oil contracts, they can now consult with Niger's uranium negotiation team. When Guinea reviews its bauxite arrangements, they can draw on Mali's experience with gold sector reforms. Collective bargaining power transforms African negotiating positions fundamentally. The historical parallels are striking and worth examining carefully. Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana faced similar European resistance when it sought authentic independence in the 1950s. Patrice Lumumba's Congo confronted violent opposition when he attempted to control his nation's vast mineral wealth. Thomas Sankara's Burkina Faso experienced isolation and ultimately assassination when he challenged French interests too directly. Today's generation of African leaders possesses advantages their predecessors lacked. Global communication networks enable real-time coordination and mutual support. Alternative partners like China, India, and Russia offer competitive alternatives to European arrangements. Social media platforms allow direct communication with populations, bypassing European-controlled media narratives. Most importantly, the current generation benefits from decades of accumulated experience regarding European tactics and strategies. They understand that economic sovereignty requires military capability, that resource control demands technological capacity, and that authentic development necessitates educational investment. The technological dimension of Niger's uranium revolution deserves particular attention. Uranium isn't simply a commodity, it's the foundation of advanced technological civilization. Nuclear power enables everything from medical isotopes to space exploration. Countries that control uranium access possess leverage over the entire global technological trajectory. Niger's leadership understands this dynamic and is leveraging it strategically. Rather than simply replacing French extraction with Chinese extraction, they're demanding technology transfer, local processing capabilities, and advanced training programs. They want Niger to become a uranium technology hub, not merely a uranium extraction site. This vision aligns with broader African development strategies focused on moving up global value chains. Rather than exporting raw materials and importing finished goods, African nations increasingly seek to capture more value through local processing, manufacturing, and technology development. Niger's uranium strategy exemplifies this approach. The environmental justice aspects of this transformation cannot be ignored. For decades, French uranium extraction left behind contaminated sites, polluted water sources, and health hazards for local communities. Cleanup responsibilities were consistently avoided or inadequately addressed. New partnership arrangements must prioritize environmental restoration and sustainable extraction practices. African environmental consciousness has grown dramatically over recent decades. Young Africans understand climate change implications, resource depletion consequences, and environmental justice principles. They demand that resource extraction serve long-term community interests rather than short-term corporate profits. Niger's uranium negotiations incorporate these environmental justice considerations. Looking ahead, the implications of Niger's uranium revolution extend far beyond immediate economic considerations. We're witnessing the emergence of a new global order based on genuine multipolarity rather than European hegemony disguised as international cooperation. African nations are reclaiming their rightful position as equal partners in global affairs, rather than subordinate suppliers of raw materials. This transformation won't occur without resistance. European powers will employ every tool at their disposal: economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, media manipulation, and potentially military intervention to maintain their privileged position. However, the historical momentum appears irreversible. Too many Africans now understand the true nature of existing arrangements to accept continued exploitation. The success of Niger's uranium revolution depends ultimately on sustained Pan-African solidarity. Isolated nations remain vulnerable to European pressure and potential destabilization. However, coordinated African resistance to neocolonialism becomes increasingly difficult to defeat. Unity provides strength, shared knowledge enhances negotiating power, and collective determination overcomes individual intimidation. For those of us supporting authentic African sovereignty, Niger's uranium revolution represents both inspiration and responsibility. Inspiration because it demonstrates that determined African leadership can successfully challenge decades of exploitative arrangements. Responsibility because sustaining such victories requires continued vigilance, support, and engagement. The path forward demands several crucial developments. First, continued African unity and coordination around resource sovereignty issues. Second, development of alternative institutions and partnerships that serve African interests. Third, investment in African education, technology, and capacity building. Fourth, sustained pressure on European powers to accept equitable rather than exploitative relationships. Most importantly, we must remember that this struggle extends beyond resources to fundamental questions of dignity, equality, and justice. When Niger reclaims control over its uranium, it's not merely improving contract terms. It's asserting the fundamental principle that African nations deserve the same respect and partnership opportunities as any other sovereign states. The youth of Africa are watching carefully. They're measuring their leaders against the standard set by figures like Ibrahim Traoré and Niger's current leadership. They're demanding authentic sovereignty, economic independence, and genuine development. Leaders who serve African interests will receive support. Those who perpetuate neocolonialism will face resistance. This generation won't accept the excuses and explanations that previous generations endured. They won't believe that poverty amid abundant resources represents natural outcomes. They won't accept that African nations must choose between European exploitation and Chinese influence without considering African agency and alternatives. The global implications of Africa's resource sovereignty movement extend far beyond the continent itself. A prosperous, independent Africa becomes a crucial partner for addressing climate change, global poverty, and international development challenges. An Africa that controls its own resources can contribute more effectively to global prosperity and stability. Europe itself benefits from relationships based on genuine partnership rather than exploitation. Sustainable prosperity requires cooperative arrangements that serve all parties' interests. The current path, desperately clinging to colonial-era privileges, while Africa develops alternative partnerships, leads only to mutual antagonism and European isolation. The choice facing European powers is clear. Adapt to a multipolar world where Africa participates as an equal partner, or persist with neocolonial arrangements that generate increasing resistance and ultimate failure. Niger's uranium revolution demonstrates that the era of European resource extraction privileges is ending, whether Europe accepts this reality or not. As we conclude today's analysis, remember that your engagement with content like this directly supports the African sovereignty movement. Every like, share, and comment amplifies these crucial conversations. Every subscription to channels that provide honest analysis of African affairs challenges mainstream media monopolies on narrative construction. If this analysis opened your eyes to new dimensions of African sovereignty struggles, smash that like button right now. Your engagement tells the algorithm that African perspectives deserve wider circulation. Share this video with friends and family who need to understand how resource sovereignty connects to broader questions of global justice and equality. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our coverage of Africa's ongoing liberation struggle. We're building a community of informed observers who understand that Africa's rise isn't a threat to global stability. It's the foundation of genuine global prosperity and justice. Drop a comment below, sharing your thoughts on Niger's uranium revolution and what it means for Africa's future. Let's build a conversation that extends this analysis and explores its implications further. Your voice matters in shaping how these stories get told and understood. The notification bell is particularly important because algorithms often suppress content that challenges established narratives. By ringing that bell, you ensure that our future videos on African sovereignty, resource justice, and liberation movements reach you directly rather than getting buried in algorithmic suppression. Remember, every view, like, share, and subscription represents a small act of solidarity with African sovereignty movements. You're not just consuming content, you're participating in a global conversation about justice, equality, and the right of all peoples to control their own resources and determine their own futures. Niger's uranium revolution is just the beginning. The real transformation occurs when millions of people worldwide understand these dynamics and demand better from their own government's foreign policies. Your engagement helps spread that understanding and build the global consciousness necessary for authentic change. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting for a world where every nation can develop its resources for its own people's benefit. The future belongs to justice, and justice requires all of us to play our part. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and let's continue building the movement for global justice together.